So hi everyone, like he just said, my name is Jess. And the program I work for is within the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute, and it is County Health Rankings and Roadmaps. I'm really grateful to be here at my first WLAA conference and have the opportunity to present some of the work that my program's doing. This presentation will cover how we used the programming language Python and ArcGIS Notebooks to simplify and improve the reproducibility of a county health indicator called Access to Exercise Opportunities. I'm first going to briefly introduce County Health Rankings and what the program does and how the Access to Exercise Opportunities measure is connected to community health before going over the workflow to construct the measure and discussing how it was improved. This presentation would not have been possible without the incredible work of my talented colleagues at County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, especially Dr. Ganwalu, Dr. Annie Rubel, and Dr. Christine Muganda. So County Health Rankings and Roadmaps, or CHR&R, provides data, evidence, guidance, and examples that raise awareness about the many factors that influence health. CHR&R also supports community leaders working to improve health and increase health equity. We're known for translating and communicating complex data and evidence-informed policy into accessible models, reports, and tools that deepen the understanding of what makes communities healthy. County Health Rankings and Roadmaps work is rooted in health equity, the idea that everyone deserves a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. One key tool we use to achieve these goals is our model of health. The County Health Rankings model illustrates a broad vision for health. It shows that policies and programs at the local, state, and federal level shape health factors, which in turn influence a community's health outcomes. Health factors represent things that can improve length and quality of life if modified. They are predictors of how healthy our communities can be in the future. And the four health factor areas in our model are health behaviors, clinical care, social and economic factors, and the physical environment. Health outcomes represent how healthy a county is right now. They reflect the physical and mental well-being of residents through measures representing the length and quality of life typically experienced in a community. We have more than 80 individual measures in the model as health factors or health outcomes, and you'll also notice that we take a holistic approach to health. Community health is about so much more than eating well or going to the doctor. Research has shown that socioeconomic factors like income and education, as well as the physical environment, play a significant role in health. And in public health, these are what we often call the social determinants of health. The county health indicator or measure that's the focus of this presentation is called Access to Exercise Opportunities. It's a measure of access and opportunities for a member of a community to support their health by engaging in physical activity. In our model of health, it's situated within the health behaviors factor area, and we added this measure to our data set in 2014. Access to exercise opportunities is included in the model because the built environment is important for encouraging healthy behaviors like physical activity. Individuals who live closer to sidewalks, parks, and gyms are more likely to exercise, and increased physical activity is associated with lower risks of type 2 diabetes, cancer, stroke, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and premature mortality independent of obesity. There's extensive research that shows that physical activity reduces symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. And specifically, access to parks has positive impacts on mental well-being, even if the park is recreation or sport-focused instead of nature-focused. It's important to understand how much of the population has access to the benefits provided by green space and areas to exercise because the equitable distribution of these spaces is important for ensuring health equity and environmental justice. The access to exercise measure is the percentage of the resident population in a county with adequate access to locations for physical activity. Adequate access is defined as residing within a census block where the border of the census block is a half mile or less from a park, 1 mile or less from a recreational facility in an urban area, or 3 miles or less from a recreational facility in a rural area. The numerator is the total population living in these census blocks with adequate access, and the denominator is the total county population. I will note that this measure does not tell us the reason for low access in a given county, and it's not inclusive of all exercise opportunities within a community. For instance, sidewalks, which serve as locations for running or walking, malls, which may have walking clubs, and schools, which may have gymnasiums open to community members, are not captured in the measure. Additionally, access to parks may be made difficult by entrance location, busy streets, or complex street designs. Parks and recreational facilities may have varying amenities, and there are fees associated with access to some recreational facilities. So now I'm going to go over the construction of the measure and how Python and ArcGIS notebooks were used to mitigate risks to the original manual point-and-click workflow that we used. Python is a general-purpose programming language that can be used for data analysis and task automation, and ArcGIS Notebooks provides a Jupyter Notebook experience that allows users to create documents that contain live Python code and narrative text. The construction of this measure is complex, and it used to take several weeks to complete. It has 5 input data sets, which I'll show on the next slide, and it requires the use of multiple ArcGIS tools. One risk year to year was that different tool parameters may not have been documented, and there might have been different parameters used for something like the buffer tool, and this made the measure difficult to reproduce year over year. Additionally, the measure was constructed using ArcGIS Pro and SAS, and exporting individual outputs from tools from ArcGIS Pro and inputting them into SAS used to take a lot of time. And the use of point and click in ArcGIS Pro left room for human error when interacting with the geoprocessing tool interfaces, and meant that collaboration was limited to teammates that had GIS experience. So these are the 5 input data sets used in the construction of this measures. We use a USA Parks layer package from ArcGIS Online, recreational facility locations with the SIC codes shown on the slide from Esri's business analyst, YMCA facility locations provided by the YMCA, and census urban areas and blocks from the census Tigerline shapefiles. The ArcGIS business analyst and census block data sets in particular are very large. This past year we pulled more than 76,000 records from business analysts for recreational facilities, and there are more than 8 million census blocks from the 2020 decennial census. So this is a diagram of the workflow that was previously used to construct the measure, and there's no need to try to read everything. The purpose I'm just trying to communicate is that it's complex, and this used to all be done point and click in ArcGIS Pro. So, well, this portion was point and click. The portion on the bottom was completed in SAS. So some of the key steps that are important for understanding the construction of the measure and some of the weaknesses of the past workflow are as follows. One is the creation of buffers around parks, YMCAs, and business analyst recreational facilities. For the recreational facilities, the size of the buffer depends on the facility's urban and rural status. And 2, once all of the buffers are created around the parks and recreational facilities, we merge them together and dissolve them into one large multi-part polygon, which I'll refer to as the All Parks and Rec Facilities polygon. As I mentioned earlier, the buffer tool is one where all the parameters entered into the tool weren't documented year to year, so this made it difficult to duplicate the workflow and get the same exact results. This image shows Wisconsin, and it's what the buffered parks and recreational facilities look like. So there are 2 possible method parameters when you're using buffer or a pairwise buffer in ArcGIS Pro, planar and geodesic. And I definitely had to look these up in documentation to understand what the differences were. But the default method parameter is planar. And with the planar method, the tool will create Euclidean buffers if the input features have a projected coordinate system. So it will do that by default. But if you do not have a projected coordinate system for your input features and you specify a buffer distance in linear units, the tool will create geodesic buffers. So in the past, something that I discovered was that we had input data sets that were in projected coordinate systems and some that were not. And without knowing for sure which method parameter was used when the tool was run for the analysis, we may have ended up with a mix of Euclidean and geodesic buffers, which could have introduced error because then everything gets merged and dissolved together. So a big advantage of the Python code in notebooks was that all of the parameters for all of the geoprocessing tools are typed out. You can see all of them, and then you can also use Markdown in the notebook to document the rationale behind which parameters were used and include links to documentation. So this is a screenshot of my notebook. It shows the notes and links to external documentation that can be included next to the code. I'm definitely a fan of over-documenting because I will also forget year to year why I did something. So going back to key steps in the workflow, the third step to note is that the census blocks in each state are intersected with the All Parks and Rec Facilities polygon. And the population in the census blocks that intersect with that polygon is the population that has access to exercise opportunities. The intersect tool is run 51 times because the census block files are so large and my computer is only so powerful, the tool will run for several hours in states like California and Texas. And because of how time-consuming this step is, both to re-enter parameters in the tool interface and to let the tool run, it used to be spread over multiple days in the past. So the automation of this step with the Python code is one of the biggest reasons why so much time was saved in the updated workflow. This is what the output of the intersect step looks like. So this is census blocks in Wisconsin that were intersected with the buffered parks and recreational facilities, just as a visual representation. And then finally, in the past workflow, the attribute tables of the outputs from the intersect tool were exported from Pro and then brought into SAS for the final aggregation of the data to the county level, and to then calculate the population that has access to exercise. So it used to be like taking the outputs from the 51 runs of the intersect tool into SAS and then aggregating from 51 input data sets. So this is the current workflow. Python and ArcGIS Notebooks allowed the workflow to be completed almost entirely in Pro. And there's no need to focus on reading the whole slide. This emphasizes that more steps were completed in Pro and the workflow is streamlined a little bit more. So the aggregation to the county level of the population with access to exercise and the total population for each county was done with the statistics tool. And the final measure, which is the percent of the county population living in census blocks with access to exercise, was calculated using the calculate field tool. Additionally, earlier in the process, the YMCA and business analyst rec facilities were merged into one set of features before being assigned urban and rural status, which meant that the buffer tool was only run 3 times instead of 5 as it had been previously. Beyond limiting the potential for human error and streamlining the workflow, one of my favorite advantages provided by the use of Python and notebooks was the ability to collaborate more easily with teammates that don't have a lot of GIS software experience. I'm currently the only one on my team, really, that uses GIS, but I have another teammate, Dr. Ganwa Liu, that has extensive experience writing Python code, and he was able to help me improve the efficiency of the code. So as I mentioned earlier, there are some tools that have to be run 51 times, like the intersect tool, to avoid really long processing times. And I wanted to avoid writing 51 lines of code because that would have been a little ridiculous. But I'm still really just learning Python, and I knew there was probably a way to avoid that, but I didn't know exactly how. I was able to share with my teammate Ganwa the documentation for the tools in ArcGIS Online, and he was able to write Python code to loop through the tools. Really, all I had to do was point him to the documentation. And so we wrote loops for these steps in the process. So for the tools that have to run 51 times, it's able to loop through an input and an output names, essentially, for the input feature class and the output feature class. And then that make the code much shorter and more efficient. So I really just had to copy and paste the code that he wrote into my notebook to solve this problem. This image on the slide is an example of some of the code that was written by Ganwa to loop through the intersect tool. And I'll also note here that I found all of the Python code to run the geoprocessing tools either online in the tool documentation or from the ArcGIS Pro geoprocessing tool interface. Next to the run button, there's a drop-down menu, and I might have a few minutes at the end and I can show that, where you can click an option to copy the Python code. And then this is the code used to create the data frame DF that is referenced in the parameters of the intersect tool. So the data frame has the names of the input feature classes and then what the output feature classes need to be named. So it's able to just loop through whatever input feature class needs to be used and then naming the output feature class what's in the data frame, essentially. So to summarize, using the Python coding language in ArcGIS Notebooks provided many advantages for the workflow to construct the access to exercise opportunities measure. Python made the parameters used with each ArcGIS Pro tool visible, and the ArcGIS Notebooks allowed for detailed documentation to be included alongside the code. The workflow can now be completed in a single software, combining steps that were previously done in ArcGIS Pro and SAS. The use of Python led to increased collaboration with teammates without GIS experience and resulted in a more succinct and efficient code. And the automation of the workflow drastically cut down on the time needed to construct the measure. I mentioned earlier that the construction of this indicator used to take several weeks, but now this Python code can be run in less than a day. So overall, Python and ArcGIS Notebooks allowed us to limit human error in the workflow and improve its reproducibility. In the future, I think this code could be used to create other proximity-based county health indicators, such as access to libraries or community centers. And on the flip side, I think it could also be modified to capture proximity to places that negatively impact community health, such as environmental hazards like Superfund sites or major highways, or to identify under-resourced areas like maternal health care deserts. This was also a good proof of concept for my program, that code can be written for GIS-based analyses, and I think this will lead to more opportunities to use GIS analytical tools to create new county health indicators to be included in our model of community health. I'd like to again thank Dr. Godma Liu for helping to write the Python code for this workflow, and Dr. Amy Rubel for creating the workflow in the first place. Special thanks as well to Dr. Christine Muganda and all the County Health Rankings and Roadmaps team members who supported this project and this presentation. And support for County Health Rankings and Roadmaps is provided by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Any requests for continued conversation, including data and code sharing, are welcome and can be directed to us through our Contact Us form on the website. And then I'll go to this slide briefly. This is our website and our social media, and my email is on the slide as well if you have further questions. And I think I talked really fast, so I probably can show Pro for a few minutes, hopefully. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, we have plenty of time, so if you want to show Pro or if there's questions in the audience.
Thank you. I'm Sam Alvere. I work with Coulter at the PSC. I just had a question about leveraging notebooks with other workflow managers within ArcGIS Pro, like using task workflows. Do you have any opinions? Have you leveraged tasks within Arc Pro, and do you like using notebooks better for that documentation, or have you tried to nest in the task scheduling and the documentation in there? Because I'm doing the same thing. I'm working with Python recently, and I'm kind of wondering what's the best approach, or can you use both at the same time?
That's a great question. I have not used tasks. I knew it existed, and I kind of had an idea that it probably could be used for something like this. But the reason I ended up on notebooks and Pro, and I actually didn't have my notebook open, of course, is I knew that I had teammates that could write Python code, and so it wouldn't be me just like learning how to do everything just on my own, because I am the only person on my team that does GIS work, and that can be a little bit of a hindrance sometimes. And so the ability to incorporate Python really made notebooks an ideal option. And I just attended like a few Esri presentations around like Python code and notebooks, and realized that it would probably be pretty simple to copy the code for tools into a notebook and then also put like a ton of documentation with it. Being able to write markdown code and literally have like live links to documentation was extremely valuable, because we do this once a year. So it's not like a super frequent task, which is maybe another reason why like tasks might not be as useful. We're not doing it repeatedly. We're doing it once a year. And so yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, just another, are you using scheduler at all for your Python scripts?
No.
Okay.
I don't have experience with notebooks, so this is maybe a really basic question, but can that be shared to people who don't have access to GIS software somehow?
Yes, so you can save the notebook, this like IPYNB. You can open that in like Google Collaborate. You could probably also open it in PyCharm is one of the Python, their IDEs, integrative development environments. I don't know if I'm remembering that acronym correctly. So you can open these notebooks in other places, and I also know, we haven't tried this yet, but I know that you can have like the notebooks open or this Python code open outside of Pro and then still be able to access the tools. I don't know, I think we would have to modify it a little bit to make sure we're like calling the exact project correctly, because right now what I'm having it do, like at the top of this, for some of the steps, I'm just having it call the active map, because that seemed simplest. But yeah, so like someone doesn't even necessarily like really need to know GIS. I mean, I think if I wanted my coworker to run it, we would just need GIS to be on his computer, and then he could just like go through the code and run the code. We haven't tried it for sure, but we also can get fairly close to duplicating this process entirely outside of Pro, which might also be valuable if someone can't access all the Pro tools. The only thing I think that we've run into trouble with is finding like a Python equivalent for the buffer, to be able to buffer the inputs like the parks and the point locations. And so yeah, I don't have a lot of technical detail around that, but that's like one of the only things we run into for duplicating entirely outside of Pro.
In the back end, these Python notebooks are really just Jupyter notebooks. So
Mm-hmm.
whatever Jupyter software is out there, and it can be a server where you collaborate, work at the same time. But like you said, I don't remember, you are bringing in a library, right, to do all these functions, and so yeah, you might have to be connected to their system. I can't recall how that goes. It's frustrating though, because although Jupyter notebooks are Python, Julia, and what was it, R? Yeah, they only allow Python in ArcGIS Online notebooks. Yeah.
I just have a question about how you're getting the data. Like, are you downloading it first, or are you using like the API to just get it off the web interactively?
Yeah, I am downloading it first. I know that we could use an API. I am just not very good at that. It's definitely another thing where like my coworkers that are better at Python, I know I could probably ask them to do that, but it makes like more sense in my brain for some reason for me to see the downloaded files. And then like this is a data frame where we used it to import all of the census tabulation blocks because those are downloaded in individual files. So I do have all of them. There's like 9 gigabytes worth on my external hard drive. But yeah, like so I just go ahead and I download everything, and then the code brings it into the project.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll fess up to my ignorance. Can you tell me just real quickly what SAS is and how you're using that?
Oh, that's a great, that's a good point. I forget that might not be as common of a software. So SAS is just another statistical coding program. We use it instead of R. I think a lot of people use R now. It's kind of like legacy for our program. We wrote everything in SAS originally. And so the one thing I do have to do at the end of this process is save the data set as a SAS data set, because it's just what our program uses. But it's pretty much functionally equivalent to R, or another statistical coding program.
We have about 4 minutes left, so if there's something specific you want to show or take more questions.
Sure, yeah, I will say, so the easiest way that really I started to figure out how the Python interface worked for these tools is I just tested like filling out this interface myself, like how I would do it manually, and then you can hit this down arrow here and copy the Python command. And so I still have a few tools where I've done that, where I needed to do a geographic transformation because I'm not super confident in how to write that in the Python code. There is documentation online for like the ArcGIS Pro tools, how to make sure that transformation happens correctly. But so especially ones where I know I need to do a transformation, when I wrote the code, I put it in the interface and then I copied the Python command. And yeah, so I mean, this is some of the steps. I use Markdown to get all of this text to look like this. And then you can use, I'm not an expert in Markdown, but I figured out that the number of hashtags kind of influences what level of header you have. And so then I was able to nest a bunch of stuff, which I also just really like organization. So I have everything nested. I can collapse all of it into really just a few blocks if I want to. But this was the spot that saved the most amount of time, just writing a loop to loop through the intersect tool, because that was the one that used to run for so long. So we create data frames first using pandas, which are literally just creating tables that had like the state code, the name of the shape file. We looped through the state code because they all have basically the same shapefile name, just varying by a state code in the file name. And then like this block plus state code intersect right here, that's what we're naming the output of the intersect tool. So the loop is just going through different columns or different rows in the data frame. So we're pulling in different inputs here, and then we have the different output names. And so really this was the biggest piece that made this so much more efficient. But yeah, thank you so much. Oh, do we have one more question?
Yeah, I guess kind of a comment based on the first question, but also I want to mention it's really cool to see people using notebooks to document their processes and things like that. And so I guess I work for St. Louis County in Minnesota, and we use notebooks a decent amount. And one observation is we do run them in ArcPro sometimes, but I run them a lot in VS Code, if you've ever used that IDE.
I have not. But.
And it almost seems to run faster without Pro open,
Okay.
if that matters. But regarding tasks, we do use tasks. However, I guess where a task versus a notebook would differ is tasks are really useful for protecting people from themselves, and so it's more about hiding what's going on in the background, whereas you're using notebooks exactly like they're intended. It's just here's everything you need to know about what you're doing, and then some, and then do it. It's really cool. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you all so much for your questions and attention.